What's going on? What's crack-a-lackin', my peoples? How you doing? I'm Jerry Quickly, and this is happening. Couldn't be happier that you're joining us for the show today, because in this segment, we're going to unpack some of the treacherous whitewater rapids, at least if you're a wealthy Mexican, known as AMLO. The new president of Mexico, the pending president of Mexico, has created something of a fiasco among Mexico's ruling elites, not to mention some of the elites right next door in America. Joining us today to discuss and unpack some of this is Dan La Botz. Dan is an academic, a journalist, and a union activist, and has written extensively on Lopez Obrador, and I couldn't be happier that he's joining us today to discuss this. Dan La Botz, how are you? Welcome to This Is Happening.
I'm good, thanks. Thanks for having me on your show.
So let's just jump right into it, Dan. What is it exactly that has got the Mexican political class all riled up and concerned about AMLO's victory? What are they afraid of?
Well, in the first place, for the last practically 100 years, Mexico has been ruled by the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or for the last 12 years, part of the last period, by the National Action Party. Both of these are conservative parties. They were parties that protected the interests of Mexican corporations and banks and protected foreign capital. And now Lopez Obrador has gone out. He has organized over the last many years a new political party called Morena, the Movement of National Regeneration, and that party has won the election. So we could say for the first time in decades, the political party is out of the hands directly of the Mexican ruling elite, the clase política.
For someone who's not familiar with the political history of Mexico, that may not sound so striking in and of itself unless there is a realization that Mexico, for all intents and purposes, hasn't really had a functional democracy. They've had some type of a version of dysfunctional democracy light, with stolen elections and the will of the people actually being successfully expressed in this election is somewhat unique, is it not?
Absolutely correct. That is, Mexico was ruled by this party, which also controlled the state, from 1929 into the 1970s, 80s, 90s. That party controlled every office in the country, from the president to the lowliest dog catcher in the tiniest village. It was a one-party state. It began to have some element of reform in the 1970s to include the National Action Party and parties on the left, but it was understood that no party on the left was allowed to win the election. And in 1988, Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas ran for president. Very clearly, he won it. In the middle of the election, it was announced that the computers had gone down. He was ahead when the computers went down, but when the computers came back up, he had lost. So the election was stolen in 1988. It was stolen again in the 2000s from Lopez Obrador, at least once, maybe twice. And so finally, the Mexican people have been fed up over the last 18 years, 12 years, 18 years. We've had, since 2006, we have had hundreds of thousands of people killed in Mexico in the drug wars. Many people killed who were no doubt involved in drug dealing, but many others who are just the victims of a vast government repression that not only touched the drug lords, but also hit people in the social movements and just hit ordinary poor people in Mexico. These are figures that you associate with a country like Syria, 200,000 or 300,000 people dead, tens of thousands disappeared, and tens of thousands of women killed. Mexicans call it femicide. So the Mexican people became fed up, and now we have had this, so that even before this election, it was very clear that Lopez Obrador was 20, 30 points ahead of his competitors, and so they couldn't steal it this time. It would have been too obvious, and it would have led perhaps to some kind of social outbreaks of one sort or another, some sort of rebellion. So they had to let him win this time.
In an article you'd written that was published in Jacobin a few months ago, you wrote about one of the things that you wrote in the article was about Wall Street Journal columnist Mary Anastasia O'Grady, who, in writing about AMLO and what she called AMLO's quote-unquote reinvention as a moderate, she's told her readers that they shouldn't believe it. And here's the quote that you included from Ms. O'Grady of the Wall Street Journal. Morena's Declaration of Principles posted on its website asserts that the liberalization of the economy is part of a regime of oppression, corruption, and privileges, and that it is the work of a true mafioso state built by a minority of concentrated political and economic power in Mexico. If that's what Mr. López Obrador believes, fixing it would seem to require more of a socialist revolution than he proposes. So you have American business elites essentially saying that AMLO is a wolf in sheep's clothing and he's going to steal all our money.
They did that before the election. But, it's very interesting. If the way he phrased that, he said, and he said this for years, he's written a book about it, he said, Mexico's run by a mafia. It's a corrupt mafia of people who are in the ruling political parties, in the biggest banks and corporations. It's a handful of 10 or 20 families that own all the mines, and they own all of the newspapers and television stations. They own many of the businesses in Mexico. And he said that corrupt mafia controls the country. But I think it's true she said that. But other people read it differently. He said the problem is the mafia, not capitalism. And so that after the election, and right at the time of the election, it's quite interesting that Bloomberg News came out and said, it's all a honeymoon, it's all sweetness and light, it's all love and peace between López Obrador and the Mexican capitalists and the foreign capitalists. So before the election, they didn't want him. They would have preferred to have something they understood and knew. But if they had to have him, they wanted to have him, and he went to the capitalist class throughout the country, and he said in meetings with bankers and in meetings with corporate heads and so on, and in meetings abroad, he said, "Listen, no confiscations, no nationalizations. Your property is safe with me." So we have two contradictory López Obradors. We have the man who spent years and years going around the country rallying poor people, said, "I'm going to fight for you, and I'm going to defend you." And we also have the López Obrador who has gone around the country talking to the Mexican elite, saying, "Don't worry, I'm not going to harm you." Those two things are not going to be possible. One of those is going to have to give somewhere.
I want to remind our listeners that my guest is Dan La Botz. He's a prominent American labor activist, academic, journalist, and author, and he's joining us today to discuss Mexico's election of AMLO and what it may mean for U.S.-Mexican relations, both culturally and in terms of business. Dan, if AMLO is of two minds, as you just suggested and unpacked, why is big oil really losing it? Why is big oil in a flop sweat over what might happen?
Over the last several decades, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, the PRI, then the National Action Party, the PAN, both of them pro-business parties, they allowed a lot of contracts to be let to big international oil companies. That is, Mexico, in March of 1938, President Lázaro Cárdenas nationalized the Mexican oil industry. It's a national holiday in Mexico. And they have still not privatized it. But what they did do is they privatized all the things around it. A lot of the drilling, a lot of the surveying, a lot of the oil pumping, refining, and so on. That is, they outsourced, you might say, all of the industries around the core of their national oil industry. And so a lot of American companies worth billions of dollars and other international oil companies, as well as Mexican businessmen, fear that he's going to begin to roll things back. That is, López Obrador places himself in the Mexican nationalist tradition, which had nationalized that oil industry. He has promised to defend that history and that social conquest, one could say, and so the the people in the oil business are really afraid about this. There's a lot of people in Texas and on Wall Street who are worried about what exactly is going to happen now that he's in charge. I think he can't do much for a couple of years because he faces too many challenges on too many fronts. He's got to deal with Trump. He's got to deal with the American corporations and foreign investors, and he's got to deal with the big drug cartels. If you looked at Mexican business, there's 4 or 5 businesses that bring 20, 30, 40 billion dollars into Mexico every year. Those are businesses like manufacturing, the oil industry, tourism, remittances, and drugs. And the drug dealers are powerful business people, and they are people who, they're not law-abiding business people. So he's got his hands full. So whether or not he can act on more, we might say, and I think he sincerely wants to act on some of his progressive social programs, whether or not he can do that, I don't think he can do it for a couple of years until he takes care of one or two of these problems first.
Dan, this is a unique moment in terms of U.S.-Mexico relations. You have an unhinged, open racist in the White House who is threatening to destroy NAFTA, coinciding simultaneously with this moment of real progressive politics happening in Mexico with the election of AMLO. With that type of unbalanced equation, it seems as though the table can potentially be entirely reset. What is your analysis of the revolutionary potential of this moment in U.S.-Mexico relations?
Well, I would say number one has to remember how much larger, how much more powerful, how much more important as a military power is the United States than Mexico. The United States is much, much bigger. Most Mexican governments, what they really do is they renegotiate the terms of subordination at the very best. That is, unless there's some massive upheaval throughout North America that affects the United States, and that doesn't seem on the agenda here. So it is possible he can renegotiate much better terms of subordination to the United States, but that is pretty inescapable given the size and the power of American corporations. And he can try to defend Mexican sovereignty and national dignity against this, as you said, the unhinged racist in the White House. But the first thing he did is he reached out and he said, "I'm going to try to get along with President Trump." This is from his point of view, this is a totally rational and absolutely necessary step for him to take. He does not need to have an immediate battle with Trump. On the question of NAFTA, Trump wants to renegotiate NAFTA, but we have a real split in the American ruling class and the American business class about the question of NAFTA. We have this division within the Trump government between the globalists or internationalists, as they're sometimes called, but the globalists versus the nationalists. In the case of Trump, the white nationalists, and that division is very powerful. The auto companies in the United States have been going crazy and trying to fight Trump on his idea of just tossing out NAFTA, because NAFTA is all important to them. Automobiles are all now globally produced. We have world production. And so they cannot allow NAFTA to be reversed the way that Trump proposes, just to tear it up and throw it away and start with something new. That won't fly. So the good thing that López Obrador has going for him is that the American bourgeoisie is divided on this. The American business interests are divided. They don't know exactly. There's no common point of view. Some of them are for, some of them are against a renegotiation of NAFTA. And I think López Obrador can take advantage of that, and certainly will have to if he's going to renegotiate the terms with the United States in a broader sense.
Dan, if you could break down the fear of AMLO into what the largest fear is, particularly among Mexican political class, and what is their largest fear, and also concurrently, what is the powerful U.S. interests' largest fear of AMLO? Are they one and the same, or are their fears, in fact, operating on separate tracks?
Well, I think, yes, I think they're probably on separate tracks. I mean, in Mexico, for years and years, they attacked him, the major media and the big business interests, as he will be another Hugo Chavez. He will bring a socialism to Mexico that will be a failure and lead to violence. and they would show violent clips constantly. So their fear is that López Obrador is going to lead to a social upheaval that threatens the Mexican capitalist class. In the United States, I think the fear is probably somewhat different. Their concerns are more about what is going to happen to our investments. How is this going to affect NAFTA? How, as you raise these questions, how is it going to affect NAFTA? How it's going to affect the oil industry? What's it going to mean for the United States? Very interestingly, as I said, not only did he reach out to Trump, there was also just a meeting in the last week or two with U.S. and Mexican authorities that they're going to cooperate in trying to suppress the drug trade in Mexico, they say. So, the United States, I think, has a different set of fears. In Mexico, it's very visceral for some people in Mexico who just loathe him because he was a high school history teacher. He rose up first in the PRI and then in the PRD. He calls the ruling elite a mafia. They hate him in their guts. They can't stand him. They're blinded sometimes by their hatred. But I think also, as is indicated, as long as he placates them, they are prepared to live with him, and they're prepared to see if they can tame him, as capital so often tames the people who come with a whip and a chair and think that they're going to subdue capital.
What happens when AMLO can't be contained, or if he can't be contained? Essentially, what happens if they can't buy him out or contain him?
I don't think that's exactly the issue, if I may put it this way. I think the issue is that he has raised the hopes of many millions of Mexican people. He is containable, I think. I think he's a politician, and I think he's containable, and I don't think he's as radical as people give him credit for. But what he has done is he has raised the hopes of millions of Mexican people who now believe that they're going to have they're going to have a chance, that he's going to stop the violence, that he's going to help to share the wealth, that he's going to help to make a better society. And that is the frightening thought, I think, for the bourgeoisie, but also for the Mexicans and the foreigners, but also for him. That is, he's unleashing a tiger here. He has put people on his Senate list. The leader of the mine workers, who had been leading a series of strikes before he got kicked out, had to run to exile in Canada. He put people from the self-defense committees, Dr. Mireles and Nestora Salgado, on his list in Michoacan. He has some real radicals who are involved, and they're school teachers on his list. School teachers are among the most militant working-class people. The working class hasn't really gone into motion in Mexico. And his election may encourage working-class people to stand up for themselves. And if that happens, then we'll see a real change that goes beyond both the fears of Mexican and foreign business and goes beyond López Obrador's agenda, I hope.
And Dan, before I let you go, can you comment a little bit on what AMLO's relationship is with the indigenous of Mexico, and how important is that relationship to his overall power base?
Well, in Tabasco, which is a state that has a number of indigenous people, it's a Gulf Coast state. He helped to defend people in Tabasco against the Mexican oil company. It's what gave him his initial reputation when he ran for governor, first in the PRI, later he's a PRD candidate, and so on. But it's not clear to me that he has the indigenous movement. We know best the Zapatista movement and the National Indigenous Congress. They said they don't trust any of the politicians. They don't trust the PRI, the PAN, or Morena, and they don't trust López Obrador. They ran a woman named Marichui, an indigenous woman, for president. She didn't take the election seriously because, in a certain sense, the Zapatistas and many of the indigenous people think politics is worthless. So she didn't get on the ballot. She didn't organize a campaign to get signatures. She said it doesn't really matter. But I think so. So that's one of the questions: is does López Obrador? He's been rejected by the most public leaders of the indigenous movement. Can he take measures that would win him a following among that people who make up maybe 14% of Mexico's population, something like that?
Well, my guest for this segment has been Dan La Botz. He's a prominent American labor union activist, academic, journalist, and author, and he's been joining us today to talk about some of the latest political machinations with the election of AMLO in Mexico. Dan La Botz, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and shedding light on this important and evolving situation on the U.S. southern border.
Thank you for having me on your show. Nice to be with you.
We're going to take a really short break, and we'll be right back.